Hola, ¿cómo están? Estamos en vivo por YouTube. Ahí aparece el cartelito. ¿Cómo están? Espero que todos estén bien. Hoy tenemos la última de nuestra serie de conferencias que armamos para este primer cuatrimestre y que nos permitió viajar desde nuestras casas por distintos lugares y conocer distintas obras. Y hoy vamos a conocer la obra de una oficina que es para mí una de las más interesantes de la práctica contemporánea de la arquitectura, que es la oficina de Serie. Es una oficina que fue fundada por Chris Lee, que va a estar hoy con nosotros, junto con Kapil Gupta, y que tiene sedes en Londres, en Mumbai y en Singapur. Chris Lee, que nos va a dar la charla hoy, estudió en la Architectural Association de Londres, y hizo su doctorado después en el Instituto Berlage de la Universidad Técnica de Delft, en Holanda. Chris es profesor en la Universidad de Harvard, en el Graduate School of Design, y fue profesor durante muchos años en la Architectural Association de Londres. Y el estudio Serie ganó muchos premios, incluyendo el BD Young Architect of the Year Award hace unos años, por la producción de la oficina. Chris va a hablar en inglés, y como hicimos en otras ocasiones, yo voy a hacer cada más o menos 10 minutos una pequeña síntesis de lo que él dijo. La charla va a quedar grabada en YouTube, y después en YouTube se pueden agregar subtítulos para los que les haya costado más entender el inglés. Yo voy a hacer pocas intervenciones por pedido de Chris, que me pedía que lo interrumpiéramos lo menos posible para que la conferencia fuera fluida. Me paso al inglés ahora. Axel and I met Chris. I will switch to English now so Chris understands. We met Chris in a collective project in the south of China in 2008, more than 10 years ago. And this was a project where 10 offices from different cities around the world designed separate buildings. And they did something which was unusual for us at the time, and none of the other firms did, which was to start their project out of the study of traditional Chinese typologies. And we've followed their work over the years with Axel, and we've seen them operate in the same way on larger and more complex buildings out of this idea of type, bringing it back to the contemporary discussion and discourse of architecture. So they have developed a really interesting and incredible to us body of work based on this idea, and turning this idea of type into a series as it evolves along times and establishes dialogues with contemporary versions. So we hope to learn more about this. Thank you, Chris, for joining us today. Welcome to our university, even though it's only a Zoom, but it's a great pleasure for me to introduce you and to have you lecturing for us today. Welcome.
Oh, thanks, Tristan, for such a kind introduction and inviting me. It's a real pleasure. I wish I could present this in Spanish, but it's completely will be incomprehensible. So it's great to see you again, you know, after 10 years. I will have to deliver the lecture in English. So Tristan, you stop me whenever you think it's a good time, but I perhaps think maybe 10-15 minutes is a good interval.
Yes,
yeah?
We can do so. Yes.
All right. Okay. So maybe I should just share my my screen. So if you see my
Perfect.
Yeah, you see it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I'll begin. So I've titled the lecture on the question of architecture as a common framework. So of course, giving such a title to the lecture is assumes, and I contend that this architecture's approach and has the ability to accommodate, essentially has to draw from the discursive relation between typology and the idea of the city. So such a view, of course, presupposes that architecture that arises from the lesson that is drawn from the typologies of the city will resonate with a certain and a common familiarity and purpose. So this pursuit of architecture that can act as a common framework, it's not an attempt to revive an image of the past, but it's actually a search for an idea that could be commonly held so that architecture will have a certain cultural and social relevance. So this interest really arose partly from the situation that we found ourselves in as young architects growing from different locations all around the world. As really at that time in which Tristan was talking to you about just now, about 10, 12 years ago. So it became very apparent quickly to us that when we were started in Mumbai, in London, and now in Singapore as well, it became very apparent to us that we were both foreign and local or indigenous at the same time because of this multiple location and being very young. So the common routes usually that practices takes in a globalized context is two ways. Either that you become a global architect with a signature style, often non-contextual and propped up by claims of progress and technological driven. And from there on, you proliferate your style, so to say, throughout the world. Or the other, which is on the opposite end, is that the architect as a gatekeeper of a certain particular cultural essence. So in a way that the architect who the media always celebrate for their Chineseness, Indianness, and so on. But we feel that both these approaches, we don't share, we don't like it, we don't believe in it. And they actually have something in common, is that they focus too much on a certain uniqueness and almost sometimes to be so desperate to become different. So we wanted, in a sense, a third way of doing architecture. So we, of course, indebted a lot to Rossi, especially the way in which Rossi discusses the way in which architecture acts as a collective work of art. And his main premise was, of course, the architecture of the city, written in 1963, the Italian version. And that book was really bring forth the potential of a typological discourse, but really it is also a critical response to the general disillusionment and the failure of a unitary architectural modernism to respond and reflect to the reality, complexity, and nuance of urban life. So the most important concept that is put forth in Rossi's architecture of the city is the concept of the urban artifact. Now, the urban artifact for Rossi should be understood in the Italian word fatto urbano, which is translated means it's just not a physical thing in the city, but it's actually something that is imbued with all its history, geography, structure, and even a connection with the general life of the city. So in a way, it is something that is incredibly involved and holistic. So in principle, Rossi divides the urban artifact to two categories. One is housing and the other monument. And he says that they both act as a propelling element of the city, but at the same time, they are also permanent structure of the city. And because of these two characteristics, propelling and permanent, they become the structure that holds the collective of the memory of the city and is something that that thrives, right? And then that lives on. So in the sense that they become a common artifact. So this reading really, in a sense, summarized here by Kriya, albeit in a very cartoonish reduction way, the way we understand the architecture of the historical European city, essentially housing and monument, res publica and res economica. Now, a very good example, and I find this is the most instrumental part of Rossi's work, is that he uses this example of Palazzo in Padua, in which he says that this palazzo is an urban artifact because it's both permanent but also evolving, right, propelling. And that's because the palazzo has moved and has been able to accommodate the changing function or changing program within the building. It has changed from an aristocratic residence to an army barracks to a market to a school and vice versa. And because of that, the structure is actually independent of programmatic failures and redundancy. So in a sense that because it is a structure that is permanent and it allows the program to evolve within it, therefore it is involved in the evolution of the city and also something that is permanent, thereby holding and accreting the memory of the city. One very crucial aspect that you see, which is at the bottom right of the drawing here, is the diagram or the plan in which Rossi has extracted from this example. It is basically the dividing walls and the series of colonnade, right? That the palazzo holds, and really it is this very same structure that Rossi has used again and again in his first 3 early projects in the early 70s. Now, I call this in a way the irreducible structure or the deep structure of the type in question. And it has a certain specific organizational principle, but yet completely transparent to function of program. So if you see from the top, is the project from the Milan Triennale. The 2 in the middle is the top and bottom plan of Galarata's housing, and this is San Rocco housing. So in the first project, even he says this, it is essentially, it is the same deep structure that is transposed to become a Milan Triennale project, in which the same walls that you see in the deep structure diagram that Rossi uses here is elongated, and in which the certain width and distance between the walls contract and expand to create at some parts incredibly wide and open spaces, and at certain parts become incredibly and unusually narrow as a space. And of course, fronting all this, and of course this one is fronting the waterway, is a colonnade that he calls between the project, that is both a space for exhibition but also a fragment of the memory of the city. And of course, the second part was the Milan housing, is that you see the same structure being transposed here. On the top is the same wall structure that divides up the space into habitable rooms, which is a space of dwelling, a space of private dwelling. And the same structure then is imprinted on the ground as elongated walls, as porticos, as a colonnade. So thereby bringing 2 moments, the moment of housing and the moment of the city, as the colonnade of the city, into a single moment of architecture. So I think it is here in which, in Rossi's project, is the way in which he draws on the lessons from the persistent architecture of the city, and then to retranspose them as a moment of both housing and monument, thereby vis-a-vis the architecture of the city itself. So I think this is incredibly instructive, where the architecture here, the resultant architecture, could be seen as an open framework, an architecture that frames, but also is open for programmatic permeation and for social life to unfold. So now moving on to taking another example. Now this is now looking eastwards, moving from the west. Now if I were to say that the deep structure of the historical European city can be understood as the dialectics of rule and exception, right? Housing and monument, then the Chinese city, I argue, is constructed out of just one dominant type, the courtyard house. Or to be more specific, is essentially the deep structure of the walled pavilion. Now, the Chinese courtyard house therefore should not be confused with all other courtyard configurations the world over. And the most pronounced difference is that the void of the courtyard is not carved out of a mass. Instead, it is formed by the placement of 1 or 2-story single-room pavilions that are then walled off from its surrounding. So these courtyard houses aggregate to form entire neighborhoods. In Beijing, they call it hutongs, leaving very narrow lanes between the courtyard houses. And the Chinese courtyard house does not have, this is because also the Chinese courtyard house do not have an articulated frontal elevation, for it will never be viewed in axial perspective from a distance. Instead, it is always experienced in sequence, where one moves from wall to courtyard to pavilion and yet to another courtyard, and the sequence continues. So this sequence of open and closed space, a space for nature and dwelling, really in a sense reifies the very concept of yin and yang, that is to say that the alternation of binary opposites. So this singular deep structure defines actually the entire city at various scales. So for instance, you see the city of Beijing from the Qing dynasty onwards and pre-1948, a compound. And further down, of course, the walls of the neighborhoods, and
Chris,
finally the walls
we
of
lost
the
the
courtyards.
connection for a minute, so we couldn't
For,
hear. Yeah, we
oh,
couldn't
really? For a
hear.
minute? That long?
Yeah. Well, no, maybe
Okay.
30 seconds. Yeah. From only that slide. The
Only
forbidden.
this slide, yeah?
Okay.
Onwards and to 1948, for instance, is defined by various city walls, right? So one that defines the extreme border of the city or the original city, and the other wall on the south defines the extension, and the scale down. Here you see it then closes the imperial compound, and further down the walls of neighborhoods, and finally the walls of the courtyard house itself. So they all demonstrate the same deep structure, that is to say that the walls enclosing an agglomeration of pavilions. Now, another important observation that can be made here is that the deep structure of the city here is the same as what Rossi has said. This is independent of program. That is to say that the same courtyard house serves as dwelling for families, for administrative offices of the state, school, clinics, clan association, and the multitude of social and cultural life that you find in the city. Another example that I really like to use, but now from the art world, is one that illuminates our thinking about type, and its trope for precedence, seriality, commonality. And this is the work of Edmond Deval. And in this example, you see that each and every one of these objects are different, but yet they also share something. Importantly, it declares that what is common among singularity. So I think the idea that there's a potential for a frame to be a common framework for difference is something that is very powerful for us. So what is also very striking for me is also the care and the varieties of ways in which Deval treats this act of framing, for instance, by placing different objects together, its spacing, the various heights in which he places the stacks. So far our work has been about the propensity of architecture to accommodate difference, and it served therefore as a backdrop for programmatic life to unfold. So we like to see that our work is kind of mute, and we hope that they resonate with a strange familiarity in any context in which we find ourselves working in. So I'll speak about 5 of this today, certain recurring structures. So Tristan, so this is where I will launch into the project. So I wonder if you want to stop
I will
here.
translate. Yeah, I will
Yeah,
make a
okay. All right. Okay.
Chris habla de un marco común que se da a partir de la relación entre la tipología y la ciudad. Y pensar en estos referentes del pasado no es para replicarlos, sino para que la arquitectura gane una relevancia cultural y social a partir de usarlos. Tienen ellos en su práctica, que empezaron en Mumbai y en Londres, siempre fueron a la vez extranjeros y un poco locales. Y entonces se preguntan de qué manera la práctica de la arquitectura se relaciona con esto. Hay una práctica normal que es el arquitecto globalizado, que a partir de una base impone su estilo de diseño en distintos países, y también existe la tradición opuesta, que es una especie de arquitectos que son guardianes de una cultura local. Ambas tienen en común la preocupación por los objetos únicos. Y ellos piensan que, o buscaron posicionarse en una situación intermedia entre los dos. Entonces, para esto usan la teoría de Rossi, de la tipología, del artefacto urbano, que Rossi presenta en la arquitectura de la ciudad, en la que habla de la vivienda y el monumento, y toma el ejemplo de la estructura en permanente transformación para mostrar cuál es la estructura profunda de la tipología y del edificio. Y esa estructura profunda o irreductible es la que Rossi desarrolla, por ejemplo, en el edificio del Galaratese, en el que se ve esta serie de columnas que relacionan la planta baja, que tiene que ver con la ciudad o con el monumento, y las plantas altas de viviendas, a través de la misma idea de estructura profunda. Y si salimos del mundo occidental, En China, la estructura profunda de las ciudades tiene que ver con las casas con patio, y las casas con patio no están formadas por sacarle un vacío a un volumen lleno, como el patio occidental, sino que están formadas por agrupar pequeños objetos alrededor. Es decir, la ciudad china es un agregado de pequeñas de estructuras menores que forman estos patios. Esto define que no tengan una estructura de frente, pero que esa estructura profunda, que es la del patio, sirve para explicar en distintas escalas toda la ciudad de Berlín. Y lo mismo pasa en el mundo del arte, en las que estos objetos que mostraba cerámicos son todos singulares, pero a la vez comparten una enorme cantidad de cosas en común. Y a través del uso de los tipos, lo que intenta el estudio es que los proyectos resuenen con cosas que ya existen y establezcan relaciones con cosas que ya existen y que son familiares. Okay.
That's thanks, Tristan. Okay, so maybe I will run through maybe two projects and then we stop again, Tristan. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'll continue. So let me start with a project. It's Oasis Terrace. So this was just completed earlier last year. So it's the brief is actually for a new generation of neighborhood centers for the Housing Development Board. Housing Development Board essentially is the housing agency of the government in Singapore that provides about 80% of housing to its entire citizens. So that's a very, very big number. So this is the site, and when we first started, the brief that was prepared by HDB called for the creation of a new typology. Essentially, it's an integrated neighborhood center that will bring together communal amenities, shopping and polyclinic, sandwiched between an LRT station and a waterway. And the focus of the brief, unlike, let's say, other developer-driven commercial development, is to provide a great public spaces to strengthen community bonding in the large HDB estate. So looking at Colas in his Harvard Guide to Shopping, he wrote that, quote unquote, shopping is arguably the last remaining form of public activity. So although insightful in certain measures, I do think that there are other ways in which public activity could be nurtured. So however, to date, the architecture of shopping in Singapore is this. It's a ubiquitous shopping mall, superfluous monuments of consumption as public activity. So its role really is to internalize all activities, drawing lifeblood from the streets and the city itself. And polyclinics and hospital, on the other hand, are this, right? Often designed and built as independent buildings, set away from other programs and resources often associated with the urban realm. And the closest independent typology of the community center historically is actually the town hall, right? But Singapore does not have this as a precedent. So the main challenge for us for this project is therefore not only to bring about these three very, very different programmatic components together in a new building typology, but also to harness an architectural grammar that could create meaningful communal spaces, and through that to script a programmatic strategy that could foster a sense of belonging. So where do we start? So and where do we look for precedent? So we thought that with more than 80% of Singaporeans living in public housing, the architecture of this housing has grown over the years and could be termed as a common architecture, right? An equalizing artifact that is able to accommodate the plurality of life. So this architecture of HDB is actually very, very unique to me, at least in Singapore, although they draw a lot from architectural modernism. And what I find interesting is especially those that arose in the 70s and 80s, that it has this quality of an open framework as an unassuming structural expression of what it contains. And in fact, it can be argued that one of the most successful container of social life in Singapore is the void deck on the ground floor itself. It's an open structure that is able, for me at least, to move from poetic emptiness in wait of social life to unfold, to a space of celebration. Here's a wedding in union, and even in death, here's a funeral in the very, very same space. So for me, this is a space for everyone to be at ease. In other words, it's a form of architecture that could act as a container of social life, a common architecture. So our approach, therefore, is to draw from this precedent, right, and to use that, the architecture of public housing. And we wanted to create this new typology that suppresses the visual noise of a shopping center and the clinical architecture of hospital. And instead, the architecture for us was first and foremost figure forth a communal space. Yeah? So these communal spaces are expressed in three ways. First, it's a large all-weather community event space, a sheltered plaza for the tropics. Second is a cascading communal garden where communal horticulture could promote a sense of belonging to the place. And third is this sort of thickened facade, which is the veranda space, a space that allows programmatic program to spill out into the exterior, animating the facade of the building, but also acting as environmental buffer that cuts rain and sun from the skin of the building. So our first thought when we did this was that the neighborhood center should be conceived as a singular building that frames and cradles a garden. Then the garden fronts the waterway, creating a natural amphitheater towards the water edge. So this garden cascades down the entire height of the building and draws program and dining activities to the water edge. A gentle ramp provides easy access to all gardens and terraces, and they articulate the surface and slope into several terraces. The plants define and shade each of these terraces, and every level on the wings of the building have direct access to these gardens. So shopping is visible, it's vibrant. Eating activity spills out onto the veranda, but they never drown out the public realm. And the terraces are filled with outdoor communal spaces. Here, children's playground next to the pediatric clinic. And as the garden matures through the after a year now, you see that the ramp now cuts across the different terraces, and which each turn revealing different pockets of communal spaces, a hammock, a seat, a platform to stretch out, and so on. And upon reaching the roof, and then as you turn your gaze back onto the terraces, and enchanting views open up to the waterway and beyond. So the terraces here continues to the roof and is used as urban farms for the community horticulture clubs and also exercise areas for senior citizens. So together, the communal spaces envelops the entire project and is accessible from the ground all the way to the roof. Now, upon framing the cascading garden, the second act of framing defines the sheltered community plaza. So this is a well-defined volume, 4 stories tall, and is sheltered from the elements. The pedestrian circulation is threaded through its sides so that meaningful space could be defined for public use. A generous public thoroughfare divide the scheme into commercial and polyclinic area, and the pedestrian path links the neighborhood housing sites together and they stitch them as a collective whole. And it draws pedestrian movement from the station and Punggol Drive. The entrance is accentuated by just gently angling the facade facing the station, and it creates a doorway into a triple volume entrance and a funnel space that then leads pedestrian onto this 4-story height sheltered space. And this volume is also strategically placed at the crossing of the waterways and the landing of the pedestrian bridge. And the space is framed by a set of double columns, giving it an open facade with a plated grid of a AB rhythm. And when it rains or when the sun is at most searing, blinds will drop to further shade the space. So this deliberately porous facade both defines and allow the permeation through this threshold. And this portico entrance really, for me, gives a sense of dignity as one passes through the threshold of the space. And as each floor is surrounded by open terraces and hanging gardens, which overlooks the garden on the platforms, they also become a key feature of the elevation. So this third element, which is the facade, thus possesses a depth that overlays the vibrancy of its content with the nature that surrounds it. So this depth also translates into veranda spaces for communal dining, and it activates and spill out to enliven the facade of the project. So here, for instance, you see the dining gets activated after the sun goes down. The verandas is also sheltered from rain and by using roller blinds. So here is when the blinds are fully drawn, and the service facade is clad up with a precast stained concrete, and together with the double columns, I think it does offer a certain richness and animation to the face of the building. So on a meta level, so in a sense, this illustrates what I've been talking about previously, that the project, in a way, is seen as has a wider role. In a way, it conceives and cultivates a sense of commonality. So most often than not, you see that architectures that are restrained, rational, repetitive are criticized or derided for its lack of exuberance. But precisely, I think these are the very qualities of the architecture of public housing in Singapore. And we should understand that this architecture is mute, but one that also enables the color of life to flourish. So similarly, the cultivation of a community and sense of belonging requires a common framework. So it is precisely this that we wanted to distill and revalidate into our own architecture, very much like what I would think that Rossi would have done. Second project before we break for another translation, I think it's a new School of Design and Environment in National University of Singapore. So the site of the project is located at the south end of the existing school that was built in the 70s. And the available plot is actually very tight for the additional building for the fourth. Looking from the approach to the south, the site is a small hill surrounded by mature rain trees. And when we entered this competition, the design brief of the project was that the new school has to embody and also facilitate the research and pedagogical direction of the school. And the key challenge that was given to us was that we have to create a net zero energy building. Right, so that is to say that the building produces more, if not equal, to the energy that it consumes. Now, in the tropics, this amounts to about 40 to 50% of energy reduction, and this is not easy. It's because Singapore is just 1 degree north of the equator. So in other words, it's incredibly hot and humid. So for the past 20 to 30 years, you see that all new work and learning environments are like this: fully glazed and airtight buildings, and in which massive dependency on air conditioning. So this mechanical system really takes up about 60% of total building energy consumption and 40% of MEP budgets, and of course loads of ceiling space and plant rooms. So instead we looked at architecture basically before the arrival of the air conditioning, and in particular the precedent of the Malay house in the region. So there were 3 lessons that could be drawn here. The first is that the house is raised on a platform, allowing ventilation below the building. Second is that the large and generous overhang roof shields spaces from the searing sun. And 3, very shallow rooms are placed loosely next to each other, allowing air to pass through the rooms. Now, perched on top of the hill, so the new building is composed as a series of boxes loosely placed on a large platform. And then a large roof shields this room from the overbearing sun and to harness its energy. And a large 5-story screen which buffers the spaces cuts away the direct east and west sun. So the resultant is a school that is very, very clear and very legible in its organization. It's open, it's permeable, and without the associative heat gains that you find in the tropics. And the completed building, as you see here, just completed last year, perched just above the tree canopies. And the large roof here is used as an expansive solar farm as well as a teaching space, where a total of 2,444 PV panels are placed on the roof. Now, the maximum energy, however, for the PV cells that can produce based on the limits of the site is just 5 megawatts. Now, however, an educational building of this size typically uses close to 2,000 megawatts. So to create a net zero energy building, we need a reduction of 75% in terms of energy consumption. So the conventional approach to cooling building in a hot, humid climate is to use usually an operative temperature of 24 degrees. But however, if we use instead an approach which we call adaptive comfort approach, we can use an operative temperature of just 27 degrees together with tempered and moving air. In other words, what we are proposing here is that we feel thermally comfortable if we can remove heat from our body rather than the conventional approach of blowing cold air onto our skin. And this is where the energy saving comes from. So sectionally, the spaces are configured to be very shallow. It hovers above open platforms, allowing natural cross ventilation to cool the spaces, so that the building utilizes only 17% of conventional AC cooling reserved for labs. 46% of the cooling will be through natural ventilation and 26% from hybrid cooling. So if you see the graph here, just relying largely on how we design and arrange the volumes and using platforms and overhangs, we were able to achieve close to 75% of energy saving, and thereby with a 76.5 of saving alone from the cooling loads. So thereby bringing it all the way down to a net zero energy building. So the building itself has 5 levels and with different types of learning spaces. The spaces here are conceived as loose boxes placed on large platforms with ample landscape breakout spaces available for students, and the circulation and spaces wrapped around the buildings. So this circulation spaces are created almost like tube and or elongated, what we call elongated breakout rooms, allowing and fostering interaction and chance encounters between the users of the buildings. So the circulation and learning spaces are configured in such a way that they intersect one another. So here you see in the section the crit space dropping down into the raised social plaza so that it is visible from all approaches to the buildings. And this space is also directly next to the open studios and main circulation spine of the foreground. So it's the most visible part of the city. So we felt it's very important that the act of presenting, debating, and winning over audience is central to the life of the school. So there are 2 types of studio spaces here. The first is contained within the large platform with the largest floor plate organized in 3 bands, services, circulation, and chat facility, and open studios used by the lower years. So the studios here uses hybrid cooling, as I mentioned, from 12 to 5 p.m. and natural ventilation in the late afternoons and early evenings. So the studios, despite being in the tropics and very hot, here is incredibly light-filled, transparent with open views to the sea, and yet suffers no direct heat gain from the sun. So the platform is lifted, clearly visible from the approach to the university, so that the life of the studio is visible from the campus. And above the platform studios are almost like they sit amidst gardens with large overhang roofs that provide shelter from sun and rain, and also creating very pleasant breakout gardens fronting the studio. So these spaces will be used by postgraduates and researchers. They are more room-like, very, very pared down in terms of its finishes. And as working and the third space, and we learned that as working and learning becomes increasingly collaborative and therefore social, so spaces will also have to cater for that. So here, the social plaza is surrounded by shared amenities like labs, seminar rooms, a library, hot desking studios, exhibition gallery, and a cafe. So that users of the building, as they approach it from the bottom of the hill via this tube-like staircase framed by a 6-story portico and mature rain trees, will arrive at a social platform at the level of the 3 canopies. And here, approaching also from the existing building from the south, it also culminates on this level, a space that opens up to the landscape and the sea beyond it. So all mature trees, rain trees, were protected and preserved in the making of this building. And also the building is also conceived as a living laboratory where on the east and west facade of the building, where it's exposed to the most searing sun, is actually clad with a perforated aluminium curtain. And these curtains and facade is actually demountable so that students and researchers could mount their prototype facade to test against the sun and rain. and the soft irregular folds of the aluminum panel for us is almost akin to a curtain, and it brings a certain softness and delicate expression to the building. So looking from inside, they act almost like day curtains, modulating the sunlight and also keeping the rain out on the interstitial spaces. So yeah, maybe I stop here.
Yeah, yes, I will make a summary about both projects. El proyecto son dos proyectos en Singapur. El primero se llama Oasis Terrace y es un centro comunitario que combina shopping, áreas de shopping y áreas de una clínica. Los precedentes para esto eran los shopping mall tradicionales, que son espacios totalmente cerrados. Lo mismo pasa con las clínicas, que no establecen ninguna relación con el contorno. Entonces ellos eligieron tomar como modelo para el proyecto los edificios de vivienda construidos en Singapur en las últimas décadas, que eran estos edificios que mostraba que tenían planta bajas abiertas, que podían ocuparse de distintas maneras y que se prestaban bien para albergar variedades de actividades públicas, y que alternaban las cuestiones de repetición con la posibilidad de expresar, de que la comunidad se exprese a través de la manera de apropiarse de esos lugares repetitivos. Entonces plantean un proyecto que tiene varios de esas situaciones distintas de esos espacios comunes. El primero es ese gran semicubierto de acceso, que puede cerrarse con cortinas, con toldos, cuando pega el sol o cuando llueve. El otro es este jardín que va subiendo a través de rampas, y en esas rampas uno se encuentra con plataformas para hacer deportes, juegos para chicos, etc., hasta llegar al techo. Y el tercer espacio público son las fachadas verdes, que están entre la estructura y las columnas, y el vidrio que está muy retirado. Entonces, de esta manera se genera un edificio que tiene situaciones particulares y un montón de condiciones repetitivas parecidas a los proyectos de vivienda. El segundo proyecto es la Escuela de Diseño y Medio Ambiente, también en Singapur, y el desafío era hacer un edificio que consumiera tanta energía como producía. Es difícil en Singapur porque es un lugar donde hace mucho calor, y la tipología tradicional de educación depende mucho del aire acondicionado, que es responsable del 60% del consumo del edificio y del 40% del presupuesto de instalaciones. Como por la superficie que tenían solo podían producir 500 megawatts y el consumo tradicional hubiera sido 2000, esto los obligaba a bajar un montón el consumo de energía del edificio. Para esto usaron las estrategias de las casas tradicionales, que son estar levantada del suelo, tener grandes voladizos para que el sol no pegue, y tener los cuartos separados entre sí para que el aire los atraviese. Entonces, a través de estos tres recursos se arma esta escuela, que finalmente funciona de acuerdo al parámetro de eficiencia energética esperado. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Tristan. Okay, so let me move forward. So, yeah, moving from Singapore a little bit. So this to India right now. So this project is Sri Rajchandra Ashram. So the site is for this Jain ashram is in Dharampur. It's about 4-hour drive from Mumbai. And the brief called for a satsang hall, translated as basically a discourse hall for 5,000 people. So there's a huge seating, meditation halls and room of different sizes, and supported by library and classrooms. So the available site is in the form of a crescent-shaped plateau, and when completed, the ashram will house a live population of about 10,000 people, and the satsang hall right here in the middle, where you see right in the middle here of the crescent, will sit at the crescent facing the valley towards the east. So the 5,000 seater satsang hall is informed by this concept in Jainism, called Samavasaran, where translated loosely, the concept is that where the aggregation of knowledge through discourse and learning as building blocks brings one ever closer to enlightenment. So therefore, they see this two important concepts. That is to say that one acquires certain closeness to divinity through discourse and knowledge, and the other is that there's a certain aggregation towards this attainment. Now, therefore, it is not surprising that this concept is very evident in all Jain temples around the world, where the aggregation of self-similar elements creates the shikara that reaches to the sky. So the shikaras basically is not only a tower, but also an agglomeration of motifs that creates the temple itself. So our response was that the satsang hall therefore consists of 13 stacked rooms, and as they stack, the rooms get smaller the higher they go. And this rotation of the rooms also aligns to the cardinal axes, so the entrances to the building, to the temple on the right, dining hall on the left, and of course the amphitheater and entrance that faces the valley. So as the rooms are rotated and stacked at 45 degrees as they go up, they also form a incredibly beautiful agglomeration of rooms and forms. And as they begin to rise, it almost becomes as the shikara that I was talking to you about, but of course without the level of ornamentation that you associate with the Jain temple. So the when completed, the building will of course be clad by hand chipped marble strip, 300 length by 50 wide. So as the largest hall with a sitting capacity of 5,000, it is therefore placed on the ground floor, and 4 large slightly curved arches transfer the entire load of the room above. So this creates a column-free drum with a diameter of 55 meter span. So the main foyer is accessible from all 8 corners of the building, and the main entrance facing the valley is formed by 2 angled vestibules. So the rotation, in a sense, allow this vestibule space that, in a sense, allow men and women to enter separately, but they are never segregated spatially. So the drum is when you enter, the drum is immediately visible and is felt in the foyer, thereby allowing very intuitive wayfinding as you navigate through the space. And the main discourse hall on the ground floor sits 5,000 people, column free, as I mentioned. And the stage is located and slotted into the 4 arches that I was talking to you about. So on the one side of the drum, perforated timber panel acts as acoustic baffle, and as devotees sit cross-legged on the floor, there are no seating actually in this hall itself. Everyone sits on the floor. So as you navigate through the building, 4 circulation cores connect the ground floor to the upper level balcony and further up into the classrooms. And then as the building rotates, as it aggregates upwards to smaller meditation halls. And finally, culminating in the main meditation room, the most sacred meditation room with the tallest volume. So here the volume tapers upwards and ends with a skylight. So this is taken about 8 months ago, before construction slowed down before COVID. You can begin to see the rotation of the rooms already on the crescent on the top of the crescent, and you could also almost see the arches taking shape. So here you begin to see the drum inscribed and holding up the different rooms as it begin to rotate upwards. This is a more detailed view showing the circulation drum and the various voids of triple height, double height, and single height collapsing into a single space. So this is taken about 4 months back, and you can already see that we are reaching towards the final top of the roof. And here you begin to see the different volumes now collapsing together. So these are the openings that you see moving into the holes. These are some of the tests of the different apertures and the way in which light is brought in where it's only required. Sun is very, very harsh there, so the modulated light is very important. So here is the large 55 meter singular span space that I was telling you about. So you begin to see here the arches, and this is where the arches begins to culminate and meets. So Tristan, should I stop here or should I move on to another project?
You can move to the next project and I will translate two together.
Okay. All right. Okay. So from India, let's move to Dubai. This is the Jamil Art Center. Jamil Art Center. It was a competition that we won. It was completed about late 2018, so about more than a year right now. It's located at Dubai Creek, just at the tip of this island here. So this entire village here is called Cultural Village, and the Jamil Art Center is meant to anchor this entire development and neighborhood, and becomes the key cultural building in this new place. So when we were invited for this competition, so we were very impressed by the brief by the Jamil Art Center Foundation, where they really stress on two things. That they say that this art center should not only celebrate art, but it never should become a building or an art institution that is aloof and that is cut off from its community initiative. So in a way that the building also must take equal weightage, the role that it should take as a community center and to drive community initiatives and cultural and social initiatives in Dubai. So we thought that great, if this two ambition is one that has to find its resolution in a single type. So we thought that one of the best example we could look at is the Shabi housing in the Middle East. So this is in Dubai, in the Emirates, that was built in the late 60s, early 70s. They are government housing. So essentially what they are is a series of walled houses, where the houses again is composed as a series of loosely placed rooms, and in which one would have to move from room to courtyard to room. And I think this typology really is one that is both intimate, is private dwelling space, but also is brings together a social space, a common space within the same building type and within the same space. So we really, and of course, as this Shabi housing aggregates, you could also see that the self-similar structure begins to create squares, to create moss, and so on. So therefore, the way in which we translated into the Jamil Art Center is that the building is composed of loosely placed boxes that come together to form three different clusters. The first cluster is a cluster of gallery boxes that comes around to define a courtyard. The other one are enterprise spaces for administration as well as for artists in residence, and the other one is amenities, restaurants, cafes that serve the building. And tying them all together is a flat one-story colonnade that makes the ground floor behave almost as it were a mat building. So this is when it was built. So you can see that the mat building and colonnade really ties the loose agglomeration of boxes together. It defines a very, very clear edge of the building in response to the clear edge of the water promenade. Now, and on the ground floor, it also crucially introduces key open spaces or frame courtyards between the site and the edge of the building. So you see, for instance, here the forecourt, and also other courtyard spaces that are bounded by this edge. So this colonnade is incredibly important to us because this colonnade really allows program to spill out into the very skin and edge of the building, and thereby animating the promenade of the waterfront itself, and thereby making the building completely transparent and open to programmatic permeation. So on the ground floor, there are you approach the building in almost what we call a very pochette space, very, very porous. You see all around the building is one that is very, very open. So it's one that is filtered by colonnade and then open spaces. Sorry, the open courtyard. So here, for instance, you enter the building or you approach the building from the plaza, and immediately you see the screening of the courtyard by the colonnade itself. And on the water side, the colonnade activates the space, and one of the entrances also fronts the water space itself. So the courtyard of the building is very, very important. So we worked here with Anouk Vogel, incredibly talented landscape architect. And then when we worked with her, we did tell her as one of the key criteria for the landscape design is to actually look at the courtyard not only as a key social and common space for the project, but it's almost as blank canvases, and in which you could treat it as a way in which you could assemble a landscape design. So she reacted to the brief incredibly well, where she used the 7 different courtyards that is scattered around the building as a canvas that hosts desert plants from different desert biomes around the world. So the 7 deserts plants are brought into each and different courtyard. So here you see, this is the first forecourt that you filter through the colonnade. And here the different plants are almost treated like sculptures being composed, and path begins to weave through them. So this is the first space that you encounter as you approach the building. It filters you through the colonnade, and from then on into the lobby space itself. So, and moving from here, the galleries are placed in such a way that they surround different courtyards, and that as you move from gallery to gallery, you are always confronted with the view and access into the landscape courtyard, so that the appreciation of art and nature becomes a singular experience. So here it's the view out from the main entrance into the gallery itself. So again, you see that the plants here is treated as a sculpture and a piece of work of art itself. So from here you move on into a gallery space, and then from each and every gallery, as you move from one threshold to the other, you begin to see a glimpse into the courtyards, and doors begins to invite you into the courtyard. So as you move into the courtyard, you really feel a certain oneness with the plants, because you are at once cut off from the exterior, but only with an access to light and air and breeze. And you could really appreciate these moments with the plants themselves. So the very beautiful courtyards are also placed next to the colonnade and reading rooms and libraries, so that there's this in-between sculptural space. So this courtyards you see exist on different levels, on ground as well as on the first story. So, and as they come together, we thought that it's quite a beautiful form, the different agglomeration of the galleries, as I spoke to you before, really in a sense stand in contrast to, so this mute architecture, this architecture's framework really stand in contrast to the exuberant architecture that we often associate and find in Dubai. So yeah, maybe I stop here for a bit. Yeah, Tristan.
Yes. El primer proyecto es un auditorio un edificio que contiene un auditorio para 5.000 personas en un ashram en India, en el que se espera que haya 10.000 habitantes. Y el edificio, además de tener el auditorio, tenía que tener salas para meditación y aulas. El concepto de Samavasaran es un concepto que tiene que ver con pensar que la suma y el agregado de conocimiento y de discurso lleva a la persona a elevarse, y entonces mucha de la arquitectura religiosa en India tiene que ver con el agregado de células. Y el proyecto trabaja con esta idea, y en particular para la gran sala de concierto se plantea la estructura a partir de 4 arcos curvos que tienen 45 metros de luz cada uno, y que se ven en las fotos de obra que tienen algunos meses. Por encima de esa gran sala de conciertos se van acomodando las distintas, como si fueran estos agregados o estos conjuntos, las distintas aulas más chicas. El segundo proyecto es el Jamil Art Center en Dubái. Fue un concurso del año 2018 junto a un arroyo en Dubái, en una zona nueva, y Chris cuenta que lo más importante del programa, del concurso, era la idea de que el edificio tenía que integrarse a la comunidad y no tenía que estar separado de los usos del área. Entonces toman el precedente de los edificios de vivienda construidos de las viviendas construidas en los 60 y 70, que juegan con la idea de agrupamiento de cajitas y agrupamientos de espacios. En este caso, alrededor de patios en las viviendas, y en este caso alrededor de múltiples patios, esta idea de cajas agregadas. Alrededor de las cajas agregadas, que son los espacios para las salas de exposición y también para los lugares administrativos y residencias de artistas, la otra idea importante es la de columnata, que envuelve todo y forma como una especie de mat building o edificio alfombra, y genera estos 7 patios que están siempre, que se ven siempre desde el interior de las salas. Y la idea de paisajismo para estos patios fue tratarlos como si fueran telas en blanco y hacer una obra de arte dentro de esos patios, utilizando en este caso obras plantas, perdón, de distintos desiertos, de distintos tipos de desiertos. Entonces todas estas plantas se juntan ahí y forman como esta especie de escultura o de pintura dentro del marco de los patios. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Tristan. Okay, so I have two more projects. So I think I'll just present the last two, and then we can have a discussion. So this one is not built, but it's one of our. I thought to just discuss this with you and show you and share with you, because it's one of our favorite projects as well. So it's it's for RCA Battersea campus in London. So in this brief for the invited competition, we were asked to expand the school. So what you see in yellow, that's the existing school. So there are 2 strip buildings fronting just next to the River Thames. And here is a series of disused warehouses and workshops, and in which the L-shaped site became the site of the competition itself. So RCA, as you know, is the Royal College of Arts. It has it's a multidisciplinary school with fashion school, interior design, architecture, product design, and so on. So when we first started the project and the competition, we thought that the student at Battersea South Campus actually have competing and often contradictory spatial needs. So on the one hand, we could say that they do need a large open space that encourages discourse among students. And the other is a more private area for frank discussion and quiet study. So in other words, the precedent that we could draw on is really both a factory floor and a studiolo, that is to say a studio within a larger space. So the project uses therefore these 3 elements to define the project. So the first one is the use of a table structure. So the table structure for us, what is we felt great or very incredibly instrumental about the table structure is that the table defines a space, but it never encloses the space. So the stack tables, in a way, if you begin to compare to a conventional stacking of floor plates in a gridded building, is that on the one on the right is that you'll always get faculties and schools that turns into silos because they are never connected visually or physically, and they become these disciplinary silos that never learn and interact with each other. Whereas if we begin to think about them as a series of stacked tables, you could say that each table is then taken by a single school or a single factory. This school is defined within the table structure, but it's always visible and permeable from one table to the other. So that stacking of the table therefore becomes the way in which we define the different schools in the school itself. So when the different table comes together and form the complete school, so it becomes almost an emblematic spatial image as well as an experiential space that really figures forth the richness of the disciplines that exist in RCA. So here, for instance, you see that when the tables are put together, so for instance, a sculpture student making his presentation, and different school, let's say the architecture school, could look down and begin to enjoy the spaces. And moving further up, here for instance you see a sculpture student working on the highest table with clerestory lights bringing and filtering light deep into this open span space, almost 20-meter wide. So the second element that we introduce to create the school is what we call as a shelf space. So what is important for us as a shelf is that the shelf provides a neutral framework so that different activities of and events of the school could be displayed in a very, very prominent and democratic way. So again, if you begin to compare with a conventional school, which is stacked, and if you were to begin to place different resources, let's say seminar rooms, laser cutter, and so on, into different floors, very, very quickly, these resources will then be co-opted by those different schools because of their proximity and because these resources are cut off from one floor to the other. Now, instead, if you were to place them in an open democratic, open shelf and place them in a free way, this amenities and these resources almost become a very democratic approach to its allocation. So in the sense that they are placed next to the table and have very easy access to this. So as a whole, this shelf becomes almost as an urban tableau where all the various activities that are shared in the school is visible on the very elevation of the city. And completing the building is a fine layer of staircases. Here we place a lot of staircases, more than it is required. But really the key concept here is to allow maximum penetration and access between the table structure and the shelf structure, the studio space and the studio load that I was talking to you about. So the plan is incredibly simple. The staircases that separates the table and the shelf, and the tables are placed in two configuration. So these are the schools and the tower, which is the stack table, that's the research center. And when placed together, the overlay of the two types that I mentioned to you about the factory and the studio low comes as a complete whole. So in its placement on site, the approach to site are two ways. One is along Battersea South Bridge Road, where we set back the building with a forecourt and also activating an existing entrance to the school and align it with the lobby as well as the back gardens of the administrative building. So as you approach from the west, you get a forecourt and a cafe, a table entrance, and from the cafe onwards, you begin to either enter the building. So you see the first table that houses the workshop, the digital workshop and fabrication workshop, and above you begin to see the tables being stacked above. If you enter from the existing school from the north, you will begin to enter into the main lobby and the garden space towards the right, and then your eye basically glances through upwards as the tables begins to stack upwards, and of course the access is incredibly permeable. So as a whole, Howie Street facing, which is the street between the new and the old school, will be completely pedestrianized, and we feel that the way in which the table structure comes together really brings out the potential, all the diversity of the disciplines that we find in the school, and really it declares the potential for the students. So maybe the final project that I share with you, this is also the first project that we won after the first year of establishing the office, is for the new Singapore State Courts. So the site is in Chinatown. It is just at the sliver between this building and this building, a very, very tight site. So this building here that you see is the existing 1960s state courts. This building is conserved, and we're keeping that building. And the competition site was to really look at this plot of land, right? But with a very, very high GFA or gross floor area of 150,000 square meters of area. So now the key to designing courthouses, and why, for instance, this courthouse is so solid, is because in courthouse design, you must make sure that the the circulation for the judges, the public, and the defendant, the accused, is separated. So that's why you see, for instance, here, this little corridors with very, very high walls. These are the three different circulation that segregates this. So this really creates a building that is full of circulation, and is actually very, very solid, because the courtrooms have to be completely sealed from views from the exterior. So our response to this was to actually create two towers that is then linked by 38 sky bridges, so that the front tower is composed of a series of open platforms, and on those platforms itself, we place the different courtroom sizes. And this tower is completely public, is open to the public. And the back tower is the judge's tower and the staff tower, and linking them together is the bridges that we talked about. So the two towers slide very, very, is shifted slightly, so that the slenderness of the back tower, light and air, is brought between the tower itself. So the two towers is that the two buildings, the old and the new building, is connected by a small one-story entrance pavilion. Coming back to some of the precedent that we were looking at when we first started, is also that if in Chinatown, there's two dominant types within the city that you see in this image here. One is the conservation shop houses that you see here. There's a certain beauty, I think, in the granularity and the richness of the terracotta roof. And the other at the background is the ubiquitous high-rise buildings. So we really wanted to bring these two moments together, where both the granularity of the roof and the granularity of the shop houses is placed at this open platform, so in a single gesture. So in a way, it is a high rise made up of several low rises. So the courtrooms are therefore placed on open platforms. So these open platforms are landscaped. They are gardens for repose and to calm down, because court proceedings are very stressful. So the public could come out of the courtrooms here and begin to enjoy this space. So this was taken about a year ago before it was completed. It's just recently completed, but not fully open yet. So this is a view taken from the south. You can see now the two different towers coming together, and at certain views you could see the incredible slenderness of the tower, despite how big and how much area that we need to bring together. So with regards to the materiality, we thought that there's something very beautiful about the simplicity of the shophouse roof, and yet the way in which it is able to create incredible difference through color variation, but also through profiles. So all the entrance or the courtrooms are created by a precast pigmented concrete that is then stained with color sealers. So it is profiled in such a way that vertically, as your eye moves upwards, you can see that the gaps between the fluting opens and closes. And as it moves horizontally, you have larger and smaller panels. So these panels are very, very large. They are 6 meters in height, cast as a single piece, and then they are then craned onto site, and then they come together, pieced together on the site itself. So I think as they come together, I think there's a certain softness and a certain handmade quality that we really like about this project, despite the surface as having almost 20,000 square meters of area. So this richness that I was mentioning to you about also comes across in the walls of the courtrooms as you begin to approach them. So on the interior, it also takes on the same fluting profile for the courtroom, and this is just one of the mock-up rooms. As you begin to see, they're basically made up of CNC birch ply with the gap for acoustic performance behind it. The back tower is designed to be very, very simple, cost effective. It just uses a very simple grid that expands and contracts where you need them. So the vertical grid contracts where the cores are, it opens up and dilates where you need views and light. And as you move up the tower, the horizontal grid also compresses and expands to create a rhythm to draw your eye up to the sky. So at different parts of the city, you can see how that tower begins to be wedged into little vignettes of the city. So the bridges are altogether 38 bridges placed where it is needed. So I think the accumulation of the bridges to us is incredibly exciting. And the spaces between the towers are a lush landscape garden for public to use. This is the view just next to between the two towers, and this is still under construction, the interiors here. So I always like this construction photos a lot. This is a moment I enjoy where you begin to really see the three periods in history of Chinatown. On the foreground, the shop houses. At the middle ground is the high rise of the 1980s, and then our addition at the back. Yeah. So yeah, I think I'll stop here. Thank you, Tristan.
Bueno, los dos proyectos que mostró, el primero es un concurso para expandir el campus del Royal College of Arts en Londres, el Battersea Campus, y tomaron varias ideas para la expansión de la universidad en este terreno que queda cerca del río. La primera tiene que ver con la iluminación natural, con la iluminación, con los jets y la iluminación cenital. La segunda con la estructura de mesas, pensar la estructura como mesas en lugar de como losas apiladas, ya que esto permitía conexiones visuales entre las distintas partes de la escuela, ¿no? entre los distintos departamentos y los distintos sectores. La otra idea es que además del conjunto de mesas, hay otra estructura, que es la que llama de biblioteca o de estantería, donde están todos los espacios comunes de la escuela. Aulas, salas de ploteo, salas de cortadores, etc. Entonces todo lo que se comparte está apilado, y hay entre la estructura de mesas y la estructura de estantes múltiples escaleras para que todas estas conexiones se puedan hacer fácilmente. Entonces una fachada, que es la de las mesas, es la que mira al río, y la otra es la que muestra a la ciudad todos estos espacios compartidos. El último proyecto es el primer concurso que ganaron en realidad, y que ahora está terminando de construirse en Singapur, que es un edificio de juzgados en Chinatown, en Singapur. Y la dificultad era trabajar con los tres tipos de circulación que no tenían que juntarse, que es lo habitual en edificios de juzgados, ¿no? La circulación de los jueces, la circulación del público y la circulación de los detenidos. Entonces el proyecto se piensa como dos torres, una para jueces y una para público, y la torre del público es la que tiene distintas alturas, y ahí aparecen como cajitas cada una de las salas de los juzgados. Entre las dos torres hay 38 puentes que los unen, y las dos torres están levemente desfasadas entre sí para tener mejor iluminación. Y en relación a los materiales, trabaja con las dos tipologías del entorno, que son primero las casas bajas con techos de teja, que son la tipología tradicional del Chinatown, y la otra tipología es de los 80 y 90, son los edificios de oficina de curtain wall. Entonces el diseño de las pieles de los juzgados y de las torres juega con estos dos elementos, con la variación de colores y texturas, especialmente, que se produce en los techos de teja replicado dentro de la estructura vertical. Okay, thank you, Chris. There's no clapping on Zoom after the lecture.
That's all right.
But this is great. We'll open the microphone for questions, but it was really a great lecture, and I really enjoyed seeing how your works brings together two different moments of architectural discourse that are like the present concern for sustainability and energy consumption, with the concern for the city and for typology, and how you use the idea of typology in a different way that was used in the 60s, and that was probably thought of by Aldo Rossi and Argan and all the people who argued about type. They were thinking about the city. Now type has like a new reason of being and a new life when you think of it as a natural solution to many sustainable issues. And I think your work shows that very well. And I was wondering how you became interested in type when you studied in London and in the Netherlands in the 90s, which were the realm of Courthouses and program and Datascape. And how did you become interested originally in this idea of typology and in Rossi and Pevsner and this school of thought?
Oh, thank you, Tristan. That's a very good question. I like any like any student, you always want to do something that your tutors tell you. You want to do the opposite what your tutors are doing. So
you didn't say that here.
No, in a way, I've been quite a rebellious one. You're right. You're absolutely right. When I was in DA in the late 90s, it was really the height of digital experimentation. Late 90s, early 2000, both as a student and as a teacher. At that time, of course, we, as students, we were really discouraged to look at history. We were really discouraged to look at representation, and all we were really encouraged to do then was to learn softwares, new digital softwares, complex modeling, looking at statistics, looking at numbers, and in a way it's almost like a machine, as they were discussing then, it was a delusion, delusion. Mechanistic approach to looking at complexity and space. So Deleuze, Rhizome and Thousand Plateaus were very, very popular then. And of course, FOMZ and MicroStation and all those blob softwares were very, very popular. So I thought, and of course, together with my other fellow students, we thought that we were never quite convinced of that approach. We felt that it really launders a lot of richness that architecture history and architecture precedent offers us. And we also always, and I always believe that architecture is artistic approach to public space and public structure and public form, and that if it wants to be have a stake in the discussion or the discourse of certain relevance to the city and to what is common, then it needs to draw from a city's history and precedent. And we felt that, therefore, there's no better way to draw on certain commonality and history from the persistent architectures of the city. And of course, the persistent architecture of the city is essentially typology. When we say that we draw from a certain building type, we are also saying that we are drawing from an architecture or a series of buildings that shares common characteristic. And they share common characteristic that are still relevant precisely is because they are sanctioned by cultural and social use, right? That they are still relevant to the inhabitants of the city. And that's why I feel that type and typology and vis-a-vis the idea of the city is still one of the very, very rich and instrumental way to approach architecture.
When I remember your project in Guyang, I remember that although it was based on the idea of type and this circular courtyard housing types, it was also building on this digital design discourse, because it had this compact roof, and so it was halfway between both architectural discourses, and of course that was very interesting. And I meant to ask you, how do you think that changed over the last 12 years, or how did that change in your practice or in your way of thinking architecture? If it did, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's also a very good question. So I think in terms of the intellectual framework, I think it still remains the same. But what we have left behind, I think it's the complex geometries and the complex forms. Because as we begin to work more and more and think deeper about briefs and the problems that a design brief brings, or the challenges that we are facing in whether it's climate change or trying to bring very complex requirements of users, we feel that complex form has very little value to add. Yeah, so we eventually drop that line of research.
I see.
Yeah.
Now, you can, anyone who wants, you can open up the microphone and make any questions. Y los que quieran, por supuesto, si alguien quiere preguntar en castellano, lo podemos traducir. Y si los alumnos quieren preguntar a través del chat de YouTube, nosotros lo pasamos acá y leemos las preguntas. Así que todos siéntanse libres de preguntar, de participar.
Wait. Hi, Chris. I'm Teresa. Nice to meet you.
Hello.
Hello. What I like most, I think, about your architecture is that you're always working with landscape and with vegetated urban spaces, and you have these kind of buffers, and it's a very ecological and sustainable architecture. I really appreciate the history and the low. I don't know if is it correct to say low-tech architecture. I'm not sure, but the most important things for me in architecture is orientation, vegetation. I don't know, all these traditional ways of the practice. So I really respect your work. I really like it. We are talking this all the time with our students. We are teachers of second grade, and we are doing a building development. So this is for us very important. And the way you reduce the use of air conditioning, and how you put the degrees, that it wasn't so difficult to. It's difficult in the development of the study, but it's not difficult if you see it in numbers like 26 versus 27, I think, or 24 versus 27. It's not so many degrees that you have to sacrifice, and it's. I really admire that way of approaching to architecture.
No, thank you. You're right. So that 5 degrees to 3 degrees drop, and if you actually look at the energy consumption, it's actually huge. And actually also as we were saying, that air conditioning, the concept of air conditioning is very, very recent. It's only about 30, 40 years old. And sometimes in the tropics, we get so used to feeling comfortable when cold air is hitting your skin. But we forget that actually the biology of thermal comfort is that you feel comfortable as long as your skin, your body is able to get rid of heat. That's it. Right? If your body is able to get rid of heat, you will be comfortable. And all you need, therefore, is air to move through, to get rid of the heat and to reduce the humidity. So you're absolutely right. I like low tech because low tech also yeah, it's also, I think low tech is not only just sometimes not to be confused with a certain, some architects do this, is that not to be confused with a certain fetishization of low tech. But here the low tech is to me important, especially today, because low tech is also means that you are using resources in a much more responsible way. And if you could use less resources for the same ambition and same aims, why not? Right. So I think in terms of thinking of low tech, I think it really is able to offer us a way to think about challenges of climate change. So thank you, yeah, for your remarks.
No, thanks to you. Thanks to you.
I lost my connection and I just connected back. Maybe Chris, you can stop sharing your screen so we can see you as we discuss. There was a question by Mariano, but I cannot see it now. Can anybody read it?
I think many of us fell off the streaming. I cannot see it.
I'm
either.
here if you want me to read it, Tristan. I have it right here. Mariana was saying, I researched you yesterday, question about Tower of Tables. As I could see, you went onto wood structure architecture. And then he adds, aren't you afraid of it becoming the rule for worldwide buildings? And that way it might take us to the point of consume where not even sustainable forests can hold the demand.
I think that's a good question. So I think no, I think that's not how you think about combating climate change. I think you have to look at sustainability in a very holistic way, and you need to balance between tackling climate change versus the culture and the social norms and the economic models that we have right now. Now, the cultural norms, the social norms, and the economic model that we have today will not change overnight. They never do. They will change gradually and in step. So you need a certain approach that is able to buffer or to regulate this transition in a much better way. So very simply, if there is a population increase in the world, there will be demands for new building, full stop. Right? The math in a way tells you itself, right? Unless there's a population plateau in which we could continue to reuse buildings, that's great. But population is increasing, right, throughout the world, and in that sense, the need for buildings will continue to increase to a degree, to a rate in which is, of course, we fluctuates from time to time depending on certain crises and so on. But in general trend, as architects, as developers, as people in the building industry, their buildings will continue to get built. So the question is, how do you build, right? So the two basic building material out there right now is concrete and steel. Concrete is the most pervasive, and concrete is actually adding about and concrete has an embodied has a carbon emission of 400 kilogram of carbon per meter cube, right? 400. Now compare that to a timber structure. A timber structure or a tree actually has a sequestered carbon of 900 kilograms of CO2 per meter cube. So what does that mean? Right, between using timber and concrete? It means if you use concrete, you are emitting 400 kilograms of CO2 every meter cube that you build, right? If you use timber, you are actually capturing 900 kilograms of carbon in your timber structure. Right? So if you were to use timber, you of course have to use timber that is taken from sustainable forests, right? And you use timber and you use trees that are fast growing. Usually you use trees in let's say in Europe, you would use trees that just need 5 years to mature and you could use them, right? So that is to say that the more trees you cut, the more trees you cultivate and plant, And within 5 years, you are taking out more and more carbon from the atmosphere into your building. So that's all about that, and that is all the most critical aspect of tackling climate change, is to reduce carbon emission, and even better, to take out carbon from the atmosphere. So therefore, if you ask me, will it be good if more and more timber is used worldwide? I say yes. If anything, do that, because not only that it doesn't emit more and more carbon to the atmosphere, it's actually capturing carbon right into the building and taking away carbon from the atmosphere, thereby maintaining the goal of UN climate change initiative of keeping it between 2 to 4 degrees of increase. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yes, it does. And
yeah,
it's very interesting because here in South America, there are like different traditions of timber construction. In Chile, for example, which is next to Argentina on the other side of the Andes Mountains, timber construction is very developed, and it's not here. It's not developed at all here. So I was wondering, or at least for large scale project, only for small residential single-family houses.
mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, what is the case in the different countries where you work? What is it like in India, in Singapore, in London?
Yeah, so I think the way it is going is that I think there's a so-called timber structure race, in which there are some people who are thinking the goal is to reach higher and higher, and the higher structure you have in timber, the more successful it is. But I think that's missing the point. I think it's not to push timber structure to its limit, but it's more about understanding what is the optimum and the most effective height and bulk of a timber structure. So if you, I think that it will be useful to not just think about timber structure, timber as a construction material and structure, but also to think about how in which we think about density of a building and the size of a building that will make timber construction more feasible and more meaningful. So I think in a way I think the optimum would be about 12 stories. So I think if we want to create a more sustainable mode of urbanization, I think we should start thinking about mid-rise cities rather than high-rise cities.
That's interesting. Who else? Does anybody else have any questions?
I can ask. Hi, Chris. I'm Anna.
Hey, Anna.
It was a very interesting lecture. Thank you very much. Very sophisticated and beautiful and everything. Thank you very much. I have one question related to the building of the, I think, RCA, the table structure, the table concept, and then in the structure, because it's very precise. My question, I mean, the tables as a structure, it's not, how you say, it's not direct, how the load, the structure goes to the floor.
Yeah.
So, no, I mean, you will explain this, but then I want to ask, then where's the balance between the concept, that the concept is completely understandable and it's very nice, and then the resolution? How do you manage? What's more important?
Both are important. I think you need to, if we just talk about structural efficiency, then we will get a graded building everywhere in the world, right? But we also know that sometimes there are certain programs, and let's say RCA is a very, very good example, where different faculties have to coexist, and there's a certain potential in which the cross-fertilization of disciplines will become very, very productive. So therefore, this first aspect, therefore, is most important, right? I agree with you that there will be some load transfer where the legs hits the middle of a table. So there will be some transfer beams that that has to be catered for. But I think to us, it's certain structural inefficiency is worthwhile here, because the larger goal of creating a more social environment for learning is increasingly more important in creative education. And if you are familiar with the writings of Robin Evans in his essay called Paradoxical Symmetries, in which he discusses the work of Miss Vendro, and he used Mises' Barcelona Pavilion, and he was saying that, look, Mies is the paragon of structural rationality, right? And yet, if you look at Barcelona Pavilion, it is structurally illogical, right? Because the columns are actually not load-bearing. The columns are actually in tension, for instance, right? So there is a certain structural sleight of hand, right, where the certain structural logic and structural efficiency are subverted in service of a certain larger architectural and spatial ambition. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks for your beautiful response.
No, thank you. Thank you.
There's a student question here. Somebody's asking, how do you create a healthy lifestyle balancing many, many hours of digital work, the main contemporary scenario for architecture, and a need for contact and hearty engagement or healthy engagement with reality? I guess it's a question more about your life than about your
Well, I suppose, you know, it's easier said than done. Just fix 8 hours of work and just leave the computer behind and step out, I suppose. We try to do that, but it's not easy. I suppose this is, yeah. Yeah. keep a tab on your hours.
Okay, but we don't want the students to do that again. Okay, Chris, this was a great conversation. It was really a great pleasure to see you again and to talk to you again.
Yes, likewise. No, thank you so much. It's great to see you again, Tristan, and Excel as well. And great talking to you guys.
Yeah, we hope we can meet personally next time.
Yes, I would love to come to Argentina. Would love to.
Of course.
It would be great to see you. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, thanks, guys. Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Goodbye, everybody.